In this video, we'll look at we'll compare the asset management or efficiency ratios between Kroger and Whole Foods for the period 2012 through 2016. All right, we'll start out with the accounts receivable turnover. That is sales per dollar of accounts receivable, which generally speaking measures how many times you sell a receivable or turn it over during the course of the year. I prefer looking at days of accounts receivable. That measures roughly how long the average receivable sits in the inbox waiting to be paid. Now, if you work for Kroger, you will actually know how much of the total sales is credit sales and how much is cash sales. When customers like you and I go in there and buy something, even we use a credit card, Kroger's going to get paid within hours. Generally, when we're talking about accounts receivable, that would be accounts receivable from some kind of corporate customer. So all of Kroger's $115 billion of sales are being used in this calculation, but credit sales are probably a fairly small portion of that. If I worked at Kroger, I would know how much the credit sales were. Since I don't, the general practice in financial analysis, you treat all sales as if they're credit sales if you don't know the actual breakdown. All right, but what we see here with the days sales outstanding or days of accounts receivable turnover is sales over accounts receivable. Okay, and then day sales outstanding is basically the reciprocal of that, accounts receivable divided by sales, but not just plain sales. We divide sales. Instead of using annual sales, we use 1 day's worth of sales, and that way we can convert the ratio results into how many days worth of sales are tied up in accounts receivable. And roughly 5 days and 5 days. Both of the firms fairly similar in their accounts receivable transactions. So don't see a lot of differences, and this is fairly common for what you would see with grocery chains. The inventory turnover, a little bit different. Inventory turnover is calculated 2 different ways. Sales per dollar of inventory and cost of goods sold per dollar of inventory. Now, inventory flows through cost of goods sold. All right, the inventory is the goods that are going to be sold. If you use cost of goods sold, it's more comparable. Sales includes not only the cost of the goods sold, but also the markup, how much extra you charge over and above the cost of goods sold to pay for the light bill and salaries and all that other good stuff. All right, so these are going to be really different. If we look at the sales basis inventory turnover, it's about 30 times for Whole Foods and only about 18 times for Kroger. Well, we saw that in the financial statements. The Kroger holds more inventory. If we flip this around and then look at the inventory conversion period, which is a nice long name for the amount of days of inventory. Days of inventory would be inventory. My Excel is acting up again, my cheap computer. Inventory divided by cost of goods sold, and then divide that by 365. So now we have how much cost of goods sold we sell per day, and that renders this ratio into basically how many days worth of inventory is on hand. And that's almost a month's worth of inventory. Basically, if Kroger stopped buying stuff tomorrow, in theory it'd take about 27 days, 26.8 days for the shelves to be completely empty. All right, with Whole Foods, it is about 18 days. Well, the type of product, if Whole Foods has a higher mix of, of fresh food relative to the not fresh food, so let's say a grocery store sells two things, bread and canned soup, then Kroger would have relatively more canned soup and bread than bread, and Whole Foods would have relatively more bread than canned soup. Fresh food has to be replaced more often so you don't keep as much on the shelf. So this is just a different business model out there. Kroger sells a bigger variety of stuff than does Whole Foods, and so they sell more stuff that can sit on the shelf longer. The It also gives Kroger the ability to buy more stuff in bulk, uh, and the more you buy at any given time, the cheaper it's going to be. If we look at fixed asset turnover, that's simply sales over net fixed assets. All right, both firms are fairly similar, although Kroger generates probably an extra dollar or so more sales per dollar of fixed asset than Whole Foods does. So some of that's just Whole Foods stores footprint's probably smaller, and there are other ratios that could actually measure the dollar per square foot and things like that. We don't generally see those in textbooks, although people out in the real world do use them. All right, so a little bit more efficiency with the fixed assets for Kroger than for Whole Foods. The total asset turnover is sales per dollar of assets. That's measuring overall how efficient you are at generating sales with the assets you have. Now, the accounts receivable turnover and the inventory turnover, those are just subsections of total asset turnover. Here we see Kroger has an advantage over Whole Foods. For every dollar of assets in 2016, Kroger is generating $3.2 of sales, as opposed to only $2.50 for Whole Foods. And you can see at every period, Kroger it generates a higher total asset turnover ratio, sales per dollar of assets, than Whole Foods. All right, and the other number I wanted to toss in there is the accounts payable deferral period. That's how long it takes you to pay your accounts payable. All right, so accounts receivable is on average how long it takes for you to get paid when you sell something on credit. Accounts payable is a measure of how long it takes you to pay the other person when you purchase on credit. And accounts payable, typically we're talking about inventory. There's something called a cash conversion cycle, which measures the days. You take the days of inventory, which we have up here. So things sit on the shelf at Kroger about 26 days, 27 days. And then the days of receivables. So on average, after you sat on the shelf for 26.8 days, then you sold it, and then it takes another 5.2 days on average to actually collect the money. Then you have what's called an operating cycle. All right, and the operating cycle is that plus that. So how long it sits on the shelf plus how long it takes to get paid once you actually sold it. So it takes about 32 days from when you buy stuff to when you actually get, let me say that again, it takes about 32 days from when Kroger buys stuff till when Kroger actually gets paid for it after selling it to another customer. And if we do the same calculation for Whole Foods, you can see that they have less money tied up in their operating cycle, about 24 days worth of cash tied up in sales, in inventory and receivables, as opposed to 32 days for Kroger. However, when you buy stuff, or when Kroger buys stuff, They don't pay cash for it, they give an IOU. That's the accounts payable. So if you then subtract days of payables, so that'd be negative accounts payable, days of accounts payable, that gives you the net cash conversion cycle, and the CCC, and that's a measure of the amount of time inventory or the amount of time working capital or net working capital is tied up. Oops, don't know how I got a false there. Try again. Add them together. So about a week for Kroger, and about 3 weeks and change for Whole Foods. I'm sorry, I didn't calculate their days of payable. It's about 2 weeks rather, because they have a shorter accounts payable deferral period for days of accounts payable. So that's what they owe to their suppliers. So a pretty big difference in there. It means that Kroger is much more efficient at managing their working capital than Whole Foods is. And again, that's probably a function of volume and the type of products that they purchase. All right, so that's the asset efficiency measures, and we'll move on from here to financial leverage and profitability.